That was actually the text that I preached on my first sermon here three years ago. Man, what a doozy. Man, this will go a little better, I think. I look back on it and I was like, oh, that was rough. Anyway, here we are. And where I was last Saturday, I was down in Indianapolis to run a half marathon, as some of you know it. My wife, Kendra, came down with me to offer some moral and loving support as I ran. To do so, she took a piece of cardboard out of the recycling bin and with a Sharpie, she scrawled out the words, Dan's #1 fan. Ah, just warms the heart. It's adorable. Well, being in the flat Midwest, this is a very popular race. And so as you can imagine, there were thousands of runners and even more spectators lining the streets. And so Kendra wasn't the only one holding a sign. And she wasn't even the only one holding a sign that said some variation of Go Dan on it. So as I ran, I just assumed that whoever those other Dans were that these people were talking about were actually giving me encouragement as well. And mind you, this is a marathon, right? 26.2 miles, or the half marathon I was running, 13.1. And there was this sign that was standing out from all the rest, even more than all the ones that said Dan on them. And this one was right near the beginning, at mile 2. Scrawled out on cardboard and Sharpie, just like all the rest. But this one had a very different message. The sign read 4 apocalyptic words. The end is near. Right? Remember, this was at mile 2, right? So, but the woman who was holding it, she was cheering loudly and a large smile across her face, so I don't think she was some doomsday preacher yelling at people on a busy city street to run faster. I think she was going for a funny joke, right, about how not far at all we were in the race. Or perhaps it was some, meta commentary on the fact that in the grand scheme of time and space, a few hours of running really isn't that long after all. And perhaps if we really thought about it, we weren't that far from the end. I don't know, either way. I really liked this song. Second only to Kendra's, that is. I really liked her "The end is near" sign because it got me thinking, and maybe this is just me, it got me thinking of all things about the Bible. Specifically about what we just heard from Jesus in the 21st chapter of Luke's Gospel, and more generally about all messages of the end of days that appear in the Bible or appear in other ways in our culture and around the world. Well, as the race kept going and miles ticked by after the appearance of that one sign of the end times, I noticed something else. A few other people were holding the same exact sign. It turned out that my mile 2 prophet wasn't alone. There was one at mile 7. The end is near. There was one at mile 10. The end is near. And then most appropriately, there was someone standing about 100 yards from the finish line, proclaiming benevolently to all the runners, yes, the end is certainly near. And I have a sneaking suspicion that this wasn't the first race that someone thought of these witty signs. I'm sure there are many races with many end times proclamations scribbled in Sharpie on the back of a piece of cardboard dug out of the recycling bin the day before. And you know what? That's the Bible too. You see, even in our Bible, there are many end times texts. There are many apocalyptic readings in our sacred scriptures, many attempts to try to make sense of otherwise senseless happenings. Many attempts to try to theologize the appearance of wars and famines and plagues and heartache in the world being turned upside down. The books in the Old Testament of Genesis, Isaiah, Daniel, the section that we just heard read from the prophet Malachi, all have different versions of the end. And in the New Testament, we get this evening's apocalyptic reading from Luke, but there's also an end-time text in Mark, in 2 Thessalonians, in Revelation. So what do we make of all these texts? What meaning do they have for our lives? Does the fact that the Bible has many apocalyptic texts, each equally biblical, therefore each equally valid, each with their own version of distinct events, each with their own estimation of miles until the finish and nearness of the end, does this mean we can't listen to any of them? I actually think the opposite is true. I think the presence of so many cardboard signs and end-time texts actually is a good thing. Let's start by looking at Jesus. That was a good place to start. Today Jesus has his cardboard sign out, right? His sign that says, "The end is near." He proclaims that the temple in Jerusalem will be thrown down. Nation will rise against nation, dreadful portents will appear in the heavens, and the disciples will be persecuted. And for some context, as Jesus preached these words to his disciples, he sat on the Mount of Olives, looking westward, seeing the sun sinking behind the majestically adorned temple, the sacred city of Jerusalem. And as he sat, he realized that in truth, night was gathering over the nation, that his own day of earthly ministry was drawing to a close. He had finally arrived in the sacred city, and he knew that it would not be long before he would be forced to leave his disciples. He would leave his disciples crucified for us and then rise again and ascend to heaven. And the people he loved, the disciples who followed him, and the small group of Jews and Gentiles who began to follow his gospel, they were left in the midst of a turbulent world. That first century AD, I guess as all centuries are in their own way, it's pretty turbulent. In the year 70 AD, some 40 years after Jesus' death, the temple, the center of worship and a symbol of Jewish freedom, the dwelling place of God, it was in fact destroyed by the Romans, by the Emperor Titus and his armies. And things didn't get much better after that. For the next decade and a half, the Roman Emperor Domitian undertook a massive persecution against Jews and Christians, killing those who would not renounce their faith in God. Jesus' preaching did come to pass. For those early Christians living in the first century, the end was near. But what about us? Some 2,000 years later, what does this message have for us? I forgot to mention this at the top, about my mile 2 prophet. Remember her? Well, in my little haste running in the cold last weekend, I forgot something. I forgot that there were actually 3 races that day. There were those of us who ran 13 miles, and then there were the silly enough ones who ran 26. But there was also a group of people who decided that a cold early morning in November in Indiana was actually the perfect time to knock out a 5K, right? 3.1 miles. And perhaps that woman at mile 2, who proclaimed the end is near, Maybe she was cheering on a friend who only had a mile to go. You know, to me, her message seemed out of place. Downright false. Maybe perhaps even a little mean. And yet perhaps she was neither being cynical nor trying to be funny. Perhaps there was a loved one in her life who was truly close to the end and who needed to hear her words of support and perseverance. It may not have been the end for me. That doesn't mean it wasn't for someone else. There will be a day. There'll be a day when the end is near for all of us. Just as the temple in Jerusalem came to an end, as Jesus proclaimed. But Jesus tells us not to worry about the time or place. It's not, he says, for us mortals to know. And until that day, when God's will is complete and heaven comes to earth, there will be days when our lives seem to come crashing down in apocalyptic fashion. You know, for some people in their lives, their temples have been thrown down. The banks have foreclosed on their house. They don't have enough money to pay the mortgage or rent. For some, even this day, this week, this month, this year, their families have been divided by sickness, death, broken relationships. For those in California, there are fires. For people in Australia, there's extreme heat. Ominous portents for sure. Just like our Bible, we all have stories of our own races or know people who are running races that are coming to an end in ways both good and bad. We're not promised a life that will be the same yesterday, today, and forever. But the good news this day, the good news that shines forth even in what we read today in Malachi and Luke, is a promise that Jesus makes. And Jesus' promise is that amidst the change and chances of this life, Jesus will be the same yesterday, today, and forever. And even as Jesus spoke these words with the sun setting on his life and over Jerusalem, he promised those gathered there that day, and he promises us here, even tonight, that the sun will rise, and his gospel will be our hope for the race we call life, that will always finish with God. And in that way, it is God and not merely the end that is near.